I think the problem is when human-centered design is the kind of apex, and that it's still, in many cases, human-centered design is still an aspiration, right? It's considered like what we need to be aiming for. And all we're saying is it's valuable. It's a very valuable way of thinking about how to create things for humans. But we need a broader perspective, which is not just about creating things for humans. And or when we are creating things for humans, what is the impact on non-humans? What is the impact on that ecosystem where the materials come from, or that ecosystem where the waste goes to, um, you know, or that ecosystem where that particular design is used?
Hey folks, I am really excited to have you listening to today's episode of Ecosystem Member. Our guest is Justin McGuirk, the Director of Future Observatory and the curator of an upcoming exhibit at the Design Museum in London called More Than Human that brings together art, science, and radical thinking to ask how design can help our planet thrive by shifting its focus beyond human needs. The exhibition opens July 11 and runs to October 5th, so get your tickets today so you don't miss out. Some of the contributors include Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, Solange Pessoa, and a monumental seaweed installation by the artist Julia Lohmann. It promises to be a must-see, so visit designmuseum.org for more information on how to get your tickets. The exhibition is backed by Future Observatory, which is the Design Museum's national research program for the green transition. With funding from the UKRI Arts and Humanities Research Council, it has awarded millions of pounds to support research that brings together UK design researchers, universities, and businesses to catalyze the transition to net zero and a green economy. In this episode, Justin, we talk about the exhibition and the broader work of Future Observatory in expanding the role of design in creating a green future. We also talk about what More Than Human design is and the need it addresses, as well as how it compares to other design frameworks and approaches like human-centered design. Huge thanks to Justin for having this discussion. Much of the work Future Observatory is involved in is naturally about creating the future. It's about approaches that aren't mainstream yet and solutions that are in the process of being realized. That can sometimes make it hard to wrap your head around the subject, but I think Justin does an amazing job of sharing his perspective on the field and the work of Future Observatory. As always, please make sure to leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify if you're listening there. If you are watching this on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Without further delay, here is the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Justin McGuirk, Director of Future Observatory. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to be joined by Justin McGuirk, Director of Future Observatory. Thanks for joining us today, Justin.
Nice to be here with you, Rick.
So, in a recent article in The Guardian, you're quoted as saying that designers need to fundamentally rethink our relationship with the natural world. How would you describe sort of the design world's relationship with nature now and sort of where you think it needs to be or what that definition needs to look like?
Well, it's funny I said designers. I think probably humans need to rethink their relationship with the natural world, and that's a worldview that has been shaped probably over the last 300 years since the Enlightenment put human reason above all things. But when it comes to designers, I would say that the classic relationship with the natural world is as a resource. In other words, all of design's materials come from the earth, whether it's plastic, stone, or wood. And that really shapes the nature of the relationship, as does the fact that design is really focused on human needs. And these are the kinds of things we're wrestling with at Future Observatory now, which is what fundamentally needs to change. So the reason why I said that is because I think that all ecological damage and the climate crisis has the same root, which is the idea that humans are distinct or separate from nature. And that's an idea that has really, in fact, it's an idea embedded in the Judeo-Christian worldview, when the Old Testament gives man dominion over all things, all natural things, everything that kind of creeps and crawls. And certainly from the Enlightenment onwards, the idea that that man is the center of all things, and that nature is there to be kind of scientifically understood and in a weird way has shaped who we are today.
And you're curating an exhibit at the Design Museum in London called More Than Human, which runs from July until October. And it's sort of billed as suggesting that designers can help our planet thrive by shifting focus to beyond human needs. When I hear beyond human or more than human, it sort of makes me think of like the Buddhist idea of big mind, sort of the interconnectedness of all things. Like for you, both I guess as like a curator and as an individual, like what does more than human mean to you? How do you think about that idea?
Well, more than human is an idea that, for me, stems from anthropology over the last 20 years. And the anthropological field has been wrestling with what it means to not just think about humanness and human behavior, but actually its entanglement with the living world. And that's a strain of theory and thought that has recently been making its way into design thinking, or rather into design. And it's fascinating to see that happen because, like I said before, design has been so bound up with human needs and with industrialization, with consumerism, with many things that have actually delivered a much better quality of life for humans, and design has done a huge amount to build modern life and the way we live in the 21st century, but always at the expense of the natural world, effectively. Whether that's through extraction and the exploitation of natural resources, or through industrial processes, or through waste and pollution. And all of those things have traditionally been considered externalities. So the point of design is to deliver a greater quality of human life and human comfort. And, extraction, pollution, waste, all of these things are considered in a way necessary evils to deliver that primary goal. But if you shift the perspective and you don't put humans at the center of everything, but you give them kind of equal bearing in a world of many worlds, or in a world of kind of many species, all of whom have rights, then things change a lot, right? And this is the idea that we're exploring through this exhibition. And it's not an easy idea. It's a very difficult idea, actually, because humans are so bound up in seeing the world from their unique perspective, and in that from that really dominant perspective as the kind of so-called supreme intelligence on the planet, as the kind of apex intelligence, if you like. It's very difficult to think about things from the perspective of other species or from the living ecosystems that we depend upon.
Can you give us some examples of what people might see when they go to the exhibition? What sort of projects and work are featured?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's an exhibition that includes artists, architects, designers. There are more than 50 participants. And the first thing to say is that the reason why it's important to have artists in a show like this is because really what we're talking about is a shift in worldview. And it's not a show about design solutions. It's not a show that is saying, here's what a more than human laptop looks like, or here's what a more than human chair or toothbrush looks like. It's really not. It's really about how we shift to a different worldview, or how we encourage maybe a paradigm shift in design's relationship with the living world. And that's why, artists and speculative designers are really key to reframing the way we think these things. However, there is, a fair amount of practical work in the show, design work. And there are, if I was to name a few examples, I would say there are designs for reef modules that enable dying coral reefs to regenerate themselves. Because, of course, there are natural systems that are under such stress now that they cannot regenerate themselves naturally, and they need human support So that's one new definition of design, because that's not a role that designers ever had to play before, when natural ecosystems were capable of regenerating themselves. There are designs for other species, whether it's, birds and insects, and the way that other species can be incorporated into architectural designs. There are designs that work with so-called living materials, whether it's mycelium or bacteria or algae, which in a way changes the nature of the designer's work, because the designer effectively becomes a co-designer with a material, and the designer cedes a certain amount of control over that material. They're no longer kind of defining the exact outcomes within, to very precise parameters, but are actually allowing a certain amount of natural processes to occur, and for unpredictable things to happen. So, those are some of the more practical aspects. There are also, there's also work by people like Daisy Ginsberg, who have, set out this way of designing gardens for the pleasure of pollinators rather than for the aesthetic pleasure of humans. And I think that's a really good example of how we might start to use design differently.
Having this pairing of speculative artists as well as designers and some of the more practical things, what are you seeing in the design space when it comes to, are people sort of seeing this as a necessity or like an opportunity for exploration? This working, putting things more on equal footing, being a co-designer with nature, like, does it feel urgent and necessary, or is it more like an exploration and optimistic?
For me, it's all of the above. I guess the reason why we wanted to explore this relatively emergent idea is because, so much of the kind of energy in the design world is focused on reducing our impact on climate change or on the natural environment is really grounded in symptoms, right? How do we reduce our impact? How do we use less concrete? How do we use less plastic? How do we produce a little bit less waste? How do we reduce carbon emissions by X% every year? And that is really crucial and urgent work, but it's stuck at a very symptomatic level. Okay, it's not a fundamental reframing of our relationship with the natural world. It's very much about damage limitation. And I'm more and more, although I don't deny for a second the huge urgency of that work, it doesn't feel enough. It doesn't feel like the paradigm shift that we need. And the reason why I'm so fascinated by this concept of more than human design is because it is a paradigm shift. It's really like a shift in perception, a shift in consciousness, and a shift in our relationship with the world. And I think we're at the very beginning of it. I mean, I think this is a process that might take centuries. Or at the very least, it's going to take generations. And I think it's exciting to be at the beginning of something like that. And I think that, we think more and more, as well as supporting all of the work that's happening at the symptoms level, that makes design and construction cleaner and less carbon intensive, we're also thinking more and more about shifting the narrative. Like, what are the overarching narratives that need to be developed that allow us to create a livable future? Because the prevailing concepts, by which I mean sustainability, net zero, feel inadequate. And somehow climate change is, as much as anything, I feel, a crisis of storytelling or a crisis of narrative, as much as it is a crisis of behavior and a crisis of kind of solutions.
So when we think about that crisis of narrative, kind of to compare two scenarios, what is it like when you talk about more than human as a perspective shift with like designers or artists? And what is it like maybe when you're at the pub or at Tesco and talking to somebody about what you do and you're like putting on this more than human exhibition that's about this fundamental shift? Like, what are the narratives you say there? Like, do the different audiences matter? Are you able to use the same terminology, or is there different things that appeal to the different audiences when you try to reframe this story?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I hold my hand up and say that more than human as a term is a really difficult term. And if you say to someone more than human in a pub or in the supermarket, what they think you mean is AI.
Mm.
And at first I struggled with that. And there is a degree to which, of course, you know, um, artificial intelligences and our technologies do have a degree of agency, and one can talk about them in more than human terms, right? But we kind of mean the opposite. And we really mean our relationship with the living world, with the natural world. And the idea that humans need to start factoring in the needs of other species and the living world into our thinking. And that's not the first thing that comes up. Again, it's a narrative problem, isn't it? Like we're just being spoon-fed tech and AI day after day after day. And then if you say something like more than human, people just automatically assume it's a kind of post-human,
Hmm.
cyborgian, tech-led vision of the future. And it's not. And while I wrestled with the term, and there are many reasons why people wrestle with the term. There are also kind of academic reasons why people wrestle with the term, but I won't get bogged down in that. When I wrestled with the term in the beginning, it was almost like, well, we can't use that because people think it means AI. And then at some point I thought, well, actually, we should probably just take a position and try and reframe. Maybe it might be naive or kind of very brave of us to try and do this, but maybe reframe what people understand by more than human.
And so we think about this. You've mentioned equal footing. You've talked about sort of explaining more than human, some people going in sort of the AI direction. Like when we think about that narrative we need to build, what do you think that narrative needs to be based on to help people identify with something that's more than human?
I think people do identify with more than human things all the time. I mean, I think people have a great love and appreciation for the natural world. It's just that when you're in your, you know, industrialized, or even post-industrial urban environment, living an ordinary life, it's, one can forget how detached or how damaging our lifestyle is to the natural world and to other species. So, I said that the root of all ecological harm is the idea that humans are separate from nature. And mass industrialization and mass urbanization is, while they've been tremendous things in terms of lifting people out of poverty and giving people better quality of life, that has only deepened the detachment we have from our connection to the land, to natural rhythms and cycles, and to an understanding of when an ecosystem is healthy or not.
When we think about that narrative, what does that narrative have to be built on? Like, is it empathy? I mean, like you've just pointed out, people do seem to enjoy spending time with nature. We have pets. Some of people have chickens in their gardens and things like that. What are the building blocks, I guess, of that narrative?
Well, that's also a difficult question. I mean, I think empathy is part of it. Empathy is crucial. The question of natural rights, or rather legal rights, is another crucial aspect. And there's a huge amount of work being done on water bodies like rivers, which, of course, and I speak from the UK, where I think, the vast majority of rivers in the UK are considered well below uh, health standards, and they're pretty much universally polluted. And there's very little protection for those river bodies, and everything depends on them. So I think legal rights is another aspect. I think starting to see things from the perspective of other species is crucial, and I think that this is where it gets really difficult. You see, because there's a degree to which you could see more than human design and more than human thinking as enabling us to do new things and different things, or as disabling, as in our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson always used to make light of the fact of people who objected to housing developments because of the nature in place there. He was always joking about the newts. There was always some kind of crested newt that had to be protected, and he always used to make light of that. But actually, if you think of an ecosystem as, you know, an assemblage of many different living species that depend on each other, then the idea that you just kind of concrete it over and build some housing on it, it's not to say we shouldn't be building housing. We should. It's just how we do it, where we do it, all need to be factored in a new way. So it's a really complex question. What we don't want to do is say we cannot act, we cannot design, we cannot build, but it does require a much greater degree of sensitivity to the natural world. And the kinds of thinkers who I think have really influenced this conversation are anthropologists, actually. People like Anna Tsing, who talk a lot about observing the relationships and the kind of specificities of a place and the feral effects of design projects and master plans, which may not have intended to create fungal takeovers of plantations or kind of toxic algal blooms in canals and all of these things, but they are the effects. And so we need to start observing those and acting in a much more sensitive way. And I'm even starting to think more about the idea of design in a minor key, design that is not about heroic solutions, but is much more sensitive and much more careful and cautious in its proposals than we were in the 20th century with our fairly standardized solutions, the modernist dream of smooth space and the flow of goods and people across, global highways, byways, airways, waterways, shipping ways. I don't know. I think that has had a tremendous impact, and we need to start just looking at all of that a little bit more carefully.
Yeah. And you talked about design sort of in a minor key, seeing things from the perspective of other species. You talked about equal footing. Some people refer to it as like more of an ecocentric view. Oftentimes when I talk to designer friends of mine, they reference like IDEO design firm coming out with human-centered design and this toolkit. And a lot of that toolkit that they created around there was around social impact sector and how we could solve the needs of people living with serious challenges. Like, is it almost that more than human design needs like a toolkit? Like, is there things we could pull from human-centered design to work in a more than human world? Or do we need a whole new toolkit to help inform designers to be more observant, like you were saying?
Yes, we probably do need a toolkit. I mean, and I hasten to add, this is not to undermine the valuable work that went into things like human-centered design. Human-centered design emerged out of the sense that there was also a form of design which was favoring technological systems or technocratic systems or engineering, and was not really made for the ease of the user and for the ease of the human experience, right? So it was a valuable step, and I've in no way do I undermine or dispense with the achievement of humanism. I still think it's a really key principle. I think the problem is when human-centered design is the kind of apex, and that it's still, in many cases, human-centered design is still an aspiration, right? It's considered like what we need to be aiming for. And all we're saying is it's valuable. It's a very valuable way of thinking about how to create things for humans. But we need a broader perspective, which is not just about creating things for humans. Or when we are creating things for humans, what is the impact on non-humans? What is the impact on that ecosystem where the materials come from, or that ecosystem where the waste goes to, or that ecosystem where that particular design is used? Just thinking about it in a much more holistic way is effectively what we're talking about. And ultimately, and I think there's no way around this, it probably does require a degree of doing less, making less, designing less. I don't see any other way around that, but that's probably a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, that's probably the first question of this hypothetical toolkit is like, do we actually need this? Can we repurpose what already exists? Are there materials or something like that that already exist that we can use? Like taking that initial scan of is it really necessary is probably a good way into thinking about a project. But a lot of designers probably do that anyways, for things that they do now. So on the More Than Human exhibition, it's at the Design Museum in collaboration with Future Observatory, which we mentioned you're the director of. So can you tell us a bit more about the work sort of beyond this exhibition that you're doing with Future Observatory?
Yes, absolutely. So Future Observatory was set up 3 years ago, or a little more, and it's effectively it's the National Design Research Program for the Green Transition. It's based at the Design Museum, but it was set up in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is one of the government-funded research councils, right? Most research money goes to the sciences, to science, technology, engineering, all of the things that any government thinks is key to, driving the economy or industrial strategy. But there's also one for the arts and humanities, and the way things work, architecture and design sit within the arts and humanities. And really the idea is that design is crucial to how we're going to create a greener economy and a greener society in the future. And we felt that a design museum in particular, has a pivotal role to play in helping to test, shape, and drive the green transition. So with funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, over the last 3 years, we have funded more than 100 different research projects. And those are research projects, design research projects that seek to reduce carbon emissions, reduce waste and pollution, promote regenerative forms of practice. And that is across the spectrum of design. So if you think from fashion and textiles to architecture and construction, it's a huge swathe of activity, and it could be related to, for example, alternative materials to plastic or biomaterials, both for manufacturing and for construction. Or there are projects looking at how to reduce plastic waste in the NHS, our National Health Service, which is the largest user of single-use plastics in the world, to, projects looking at land use, how we can produce a forestry and timber economy for green construction. It's really an incredibly broad spectrum of activity. And the way we see it is we're funding and supporting a generation of design researchers who are going to shape the way things go in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
And one of my favorite things that Future Observatory produces is the Future Observatory Journal. Most recent, I think, is the More Than Human issue, which includes pieces from James Brittle, a piece on exploring ecology through video games, and then one about Thomas Nagel's exploration of what it's like to be a bat, which actually the artist Jenny Kendler, who's on one of our past episodes, is a really big fan of that article. So I was excited to see it crop up again. And you've had quite a career, chief curator of the Design Museum, you won a gold lion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture. Have you gotten sort of comfortable, either maybe through the writing of Future Observatory Journal or in your role, sort of having these discussions that sort of sit outside the mainstream, I guess, of design, but also larger culture?
Well, I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but it's certainly, yeah, it does seem to be something that I try and do. It's funny, I mean, you mentioned the Venice Biennale, and at that time, the project was to represent a skyscraper in Caracas that had been squatted by 3,000 people as a valid, architectural and social project in the midst of all this beautiful architecture. So I guess it was an outsider position. And now we're arguing for alternative visions of what design is and alternative framings of the green transition beyond the kind of carbon accountancy and kind of technocratic ones that prevail within government. The reason why we set up Future Observatory Journal and I touched on this earlier, is because we kind of understood at a certain point that a lot of the projects that we fund, and I'm talking about tens of millions of pounds of funding here that we've put into these research projects, are tackling really urgent but symptomatic factors. Like I said, how to use less concrete, how to use less plastic, how to produce less waste. And that is crucial work. But at the same time, we felt there was a piece of narrative shift that had to happen. And the journal is very much about narratives. So what are the alternative narratives that we could be exploring that move us beyond net zero, sustainability, and things that are very practical? So we did the first issue on bioregioning, which is this idea that in a way you could redraw the map of the world into bioregions and think much more about how you can build and make in local ways that reflect local landscapes and local skills and local knowledge and local communities, which is quite, it sounds simplistic, but is actually quite a radical idea that cuts across the way the economy and politics currently work. And then issue 2, we looked at More Than Human, in a way as a stepping stone towards the exhibition, as a way of helping us think through some of the issues that were going to come up in the exhibition, and as a stepping stone towards the catalogue that we'll be making around the exhibition. So again, it's not a new idea in design. Certainly there have been people working on this for years, but to take it into a mainstream institution like the Design Museum and to try and create an exhibition around More Than Human design at such an early stage, at such a nascent stage, is really an act of trying to will it into existence, or an act of trying to kind of help shift the design discourse along away from some of the discourse, which feels a little bit stuck, I'll be honest. Like people, we're still trying to figure out what a circular economy means. We're still trying to figure out what sustainability means and, what net zero means and looks like. And these are really valid and important ideas. And we need to solve them. But to some degree, there's also a frustration with those ideas in a sense that maybe they're not enough. Maybe they're not enough of a paradigm shift, and that maybe one can achieve them through mindset shift or through kind of perception shift as much as through, shaving off carbon by increments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One quote that I always go back to is the founder of Patagonia, the outdoor company, Yvon Chouinard, who, donated his company to support environmental causes, is looking all different ways through food, etc., at reducing environmental impact. But he repeatedly says there's basically nothing that's going to change unless humans change. He usually uses spiritual, but unless humans change our relationship with nature, which I think kind of leans into this idea of like, these all things are great and necessary. Let's make sure we understand what carbon we're emitting. Let's make sure the methane we're emitting through we get all these things accounted for. But then there's this other larger thing. So to kind of bring our conversation to a close, I'd like to ask you that larger question, either from a design perspective or a larger cultural perspective. Do you think it's realistic to say that we could get past or rethink this idea of human exceptionalism, to deep ecology terms, recognize the inherent value of all living things? Do you think we can get to that point where human exceptionalism isn't at the forefront of our cultural or design thinking?
I do. I do, because I think there are peoples who already think like that, and certainly the Western industrialized mind has a long way to go in terms of making that bridge. But I do think it's possible because, there are all kinds of indigenous worldviews that think like that. In fact, you mentioned in one of your earliest questions, Buddhism and the idea of big mind. And I didn't pick up on it at the time, but, it's fascinating that you did, because, Buddhism has more than human or kind of animist thinking built into it, right? Other species have spirit. And one of the things the Enlightenment did for the Western world was to more or less disparage that idea as mere superstition and not scientific. And actually, if we were to retrieve certain facets of animist thinking that actually, you know, plants and trees and other species do have intelligence, and possibly, you know, some people might call it spirit, some people might call it intelligence, that would help reframe the whole conversation, certainly the conversation about, you know, we're much more comfortable talking about things like legal rights than we are spirit or intelligence, which feel on the edge of the esoteric. But what I'm saying is ultimately thinking about the world in that way is somehow deeply inherent in the human mind. It's just that we've over centuries we've detached ourselves from it, and I think that goes to show that however many generations it takes, and I do think we're at the beginning of a long paradigm shift, we will find a form of a more holistic form of ecological intelligence, which recognizes that humans are entangled, to use that cliched term, with the living world, and that will change everything.
Awesome. I love it. I love ending on an optimistic note. Thank you so much, Justin, for taking time to chat. Really looking forward to the exhibit, and good luck with everything with Future Observatory.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.